Hello and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Tuesday night to think about what night it was then. Tonight, I'm delighted to see so many people already in the room, and I'm absolutely delighted that I'm joined by Helen Green and Ruby Gould, who I'm going to ask to come on and introduce themselves very shortly. Tonight, we're talking about some of the behavioural changes that you might see, that you might see associated when someone has got dementia. And we'll be talking a little bit about some of the techniques that you might use to respond to somebody, to deal with somebody, and also just to sort of think about what we understand when we see some of these changes. So that's what we're here to do this evening. And just because I don't know who's in the room, who's very familiar with Twitter, who's quite new to Twitter, I just want to let you know some of the features really quickly, and then I'm going to invite my co-hosts to come up and introduce themselves this evening. So, key things for you to know this evening is that you will see a little heart down towards the end of your screen. This only really is there if you're listening to us while the session is live and if you're listening to us on a mobile phone. But if you've got this feature, it's a little heart down towards the bottom of your screen with a plus sign. And if you click on that sign, you will get a series of emojis that pop up. They're really useful for us as speakers because it lets us know that you're listening, that you're here, that you're either agreeing with things or just interacting with us that way. So please do feel free to use any of those emojis. And I can see Beep, you've done that there. Fantastic, thank you. And Heather, hi, nice to see you here today. Anybody else, feel free to just hit those emojis and let us know that you're here, that you're listening, and that we can see how fantastic. I can see loads going on there. The other important thing to know is how to request the mic because we want this session to be interactive. We really would like you to join us on the space and have a conversation with us. So there's different ways that you can do this. You can only really do this from your mobile phone. So if you're listening on your computer or laptop, then you won't have this feature available. And there's a couple of people who can't be here. Who've already sent some questions in. I think are listening in, so I'll make sure I read out your questions. But if you do want to request the mic, you might have this little symbol which allows you to put your hand up and that will let us know that you want to talk to us. You can request the mic that way. Or where it says mic is, I guess, muted or mic is off, you can request that way to speak. If you do want to do that at any point, feel free to come up. We will try our best to answer your question, take your point, listen to what you've got to say about the topics that we're talking about this evening. So we want it to be interactive. The other feature that you might find helpful is turning on captions because I'm really mindful that for some people it's helpful to be able to read what's been said as well. So at the top of the space you'll see three little dots. They're just near the leave button. Obviously don't press that. But if you click those three little dots, you'll have the ability to turn on captions. And obviously for some people, for a number of reasons, it's helpful to be able to do that and to actually to be able to read what we're talking about in the session. So that's the kind of basic housekeeping and how to do it. Obviously, as I say, please do request the mic. Please do come and join us as we go through the evening and our conversation. I'm going to quickly introduce me. I'm Victoria Lyons. I'm Senior Consultant Admiral Nurse at Dementia UK. I've been an Admiral Nurse for, I think, 19 years now, so quite a long time, and been hosting these sessions since we started. I'm going to invite Helen, just because you're on that, this is the order you're on the screen. So Helen, if you want to just unmute and quickly say who you are, please.
Yep, good evening. I'm Helen Green, and thank you, Victoria, for inviting me along. I'm the project lead for the Closer to Home virtual clinic service, and I've been an Admiral nurse for 9 years, been a mental health nurse for nearly 30 years, so a long time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you for joining us this evening. It's really exciting. I know it's your first time doing this with us, so thank you. Ruby, can you introduce yourself quickly?
Hello, good evening. I'm Ruby. I'm one of the clinic Admiral nurses in Dementia UK. I'm fairly new to Admiral nursing. I've been employed for just over a year. I'm a general nurse by background, and the majority of my experience was working in hospitals. I thoroughly enjoyed joining Dementia UK and becoming an Admiral nurse from then on. So I'm looking forward to speaking about behaviour tonight.
Thank you so much, Ruby, to you as well for joining us, and welcome to Twitter Spaces and these kinds of conversations. So, obviously, as I said earlier on at the start, tonight we're going to be talking about behaviour, and we know that when somebody has got dementia, and sometimes that you see certain behaviours that change, and there's certain behaviours that you would associate perhaps with someone's dementia, that things change over time. These various behaviours that sometimes family members will talk to us about. They can be challenging, they can be difficult to understand, and sometimes for the person with dementia themselves, it might be scary. It might be, people might be worried about what's happening as well. So this is the kind of stuff that we're here to talk about this evening. And really, as I said, it's about helping people to understand what those behaviour changes might be, what they might look like, and how to respond. So can I ask, Helen, can I ask you to just kick us off? And then obviously yourself as Ruby, I'm going to ask you this question too. What are the kind of common changes that somebody might see when someone's living with dementia? What might we get asked questions about?
Sorry for the delay there. Victoria's still trying to get used to this technology and pressed the wrong button. So I think in my past experience of working both on the Admiral Nurse Helpline and currently on the Closer to Home virtual clinic service, we often hear from family members who are concerned about some of the changes that they are seeing in the behaviour of their family member living with dementia. Quite often, those changes are around increased anxiety, perhaps seeking more reassurance from family members. There can be changes in communication and increased challenges in expressing themselves, making needs known, and that in turn can lead to increased frustration. And I think for family members, it's trying to recognize the underlying meaning behind the behavior that they're seeing.
Yeah, and that's really key, isn't it? Because often when someone's behaviour changes, that there's often an underlying reason, and there is something that that person is trying to communicate, and that's the same for all of us. Anybody, whether you've got dementia or not, if your behaviour suddenly changes, it's usually that there's some kind of unmet need or some cause or something that's happening, and it does become around picking out what that might be, what that person's experiencing. So thank you very much for that list there, Helen. Ruby, can I ask you the same question? What are some of the most common topics that you've been helping people with?
Yeah, I think I agree with Helen, and I think something that comes up quite frequently is responding to memory problems or false beliefs, or what some people might call different realities. So it might be that the person with dementia is asking to go home when they're in their own home, or it may be repetitive questions. So how to respond best to the repetitive questions or behaviours that might be happening at certain times of the day.
The repetitive questions is one that I'd like to talk a little bit about if we can now, because I've been asked a question already around how to kind of cope with those communication challenges and changes, and when somebody is asking the same question on a number of times, that can be really difficult. We know that it can be very frustrating for the person with dementia, but also obviously for their friends, their families, the care team, the people around that person. It really can be quite difficult to deal with, and knowing how to respond to somebody when they're asking you the same question again. And one of the things that I often talk about when in that situation is actually to remember, for that person, this is like they're asking it for the first time, or that they still haven't actually got the resolve and the answer around that. What kind of tips and advice might you give somebody, if to give that sense of reassurance, to help move somebody along, perhaps if they're stuck in that groove where they keep going back and going over the same thing? What advice and tips have you got around that you could share this evening? And it's even if you can jump in.
I think when the conversation does become repetitive and the person's asking the same question over and over, sometimes it's important to think about why is the person asking that question. And as we've touched upon, often it's about an unmet need or an underlying emotion. So as Ruby touched upon, frequently people can ask for their parents or ask for a deceased family member or friend that brought them a sense of security. So with the repeat questioning, as you say, Victoria, it is important to recognise that for the person, potentially they believe that's the first time they've asked that question. But try and think about, well, why are they still asking this? Is it still that the question they're asking is it about their anxiety? And in answering it once, remembering that dementia can affect your short-term memory and your ability to retain information, answering the person once and giving the person that factual information once may not be enough to offer the reassurance that they're seeking. And so they'll continue asking.
It is, isn't it? And I think with that question about looking for mum and dad, that one is quite common, isn't it, for people to want that. And the way I always talk to carers about that is actually when you think about when you might want your mum or your dad, it's about that comfort, that security, that love, that knowing that everything's okay. And so I think sometimes when people are expressing that, or asking questions about where their mum is and or where their dad is, or even wanting to go home, it's actually about wanting that sense of security and comfort and reassurance, isn't it, that actually they're in a safe place, they're with people who love them, and they've got ideally some kind of meaningful, purposeful activity that they can engage with to kind of, because anybody, when you feel anxious about something, you can sit and bubble and go round in that anxiety, but actually if you can kind of acknowledge it and then move on to something else, it can really help, can't it? Ruby, anything you'd like to add at that point around that repetitive questioning and how you might respond?
Yeah, I think it would be really important for the person to understand that you're taking them seriously, because I think sometimes with what we call false beliefs or different realities, it's real for the person, and it's just about really understanding that that's how they're feeling. So you want to mimic that and paraphrase so they understand that you are, taking what they're saying seriously and you're there to offer support. And I think sometimes we call that validating. It's letting somebody know that how they're feeling and that you're taking it seriously and that you are there to help and to meet that need. And then the other thing is something that I might add that I suggest frequently to carers is thinking about managing your own stress levels during that time, because it may be that responding to the repetitiveness has become quite distressing for yourself, and that may lead to yourself becoming more stressed. And when we have too much stress in our bodies, and often our brains don't work as well. So I think if it's safe to do so, respond to the person, and it may be that I'm just going to the toilet, or you make your excuses, and it's okay to create some space between you and the person, take some really good breathing, some mindfulness, and in all to help bring your own stress levels down, and then hopefully that we feel that we can cope with the situation better in that instance if we've reduced our stress levels.
I love that, Ruby, and some great tips there, because I can remember vividly in my own family when my grandma had dementia. My dad particularly really struggled. He wouldn't mind me telling you this and sharing this, with the repetitive questions that my grandma would ask on a frequent basis. And I know, despite me doing what I do for a job and being able to give him advice and techniques, he still really struggled, and the stress does go up, and it can be really difficult, can't it? So actually how, and being mindful of that and checking it yourself, and actually sometimes just allowing someone else to respond, or allowing a different answer to come out. So it's not, it doesn't, I remember a situation where my grandma was asking what day it was, what day it was, and it was Christmas Day, and I eventually said, 'cause we should ask her many, many times over the period of a short space of time. I ended up saying to her, it's Easter. And she looked and saw the Christmas tree, and then for the rest of the afternoon was telling everybody that I hadn't got a clue what day it was because I thought it was Easter and it was clearly Christmas. But it switched that narrative up a little bit, and actually it was great fun because she was suddenly telling everybody that I didn't know what day it was, and it was me who was confused and all muddled, and rather than her going, oh, I think I've asked you this before, I think I'm getting this wrong, and it sort of shifted that dynamic up a little bit.
I
So
think sometimes there's the benefit as well of not just responding to the question that the person's asking, but trying to explore things a bit further. And when you try and expand the conversation and look into the reasons behind the question and the emotions behind the question, sometimes the person can give you clues and indications as to what they would find beneficial themselves. And as a very quick example, there was in my past role working in care homes, there was a lady who every evening would become very, very anxious and look for her father. And the care home staff understandably weren't sure how best to address it. But when we spoke to her and asked her why she was wanting to see her father and what her father would say, her response was, well, he'd tell me to pull my socks up. And in situations moving on from there, all the care staff had to say to us, well, come on, if your dad was here, he'd tell you to pull your socks up. And it worked perfectly. And all she actually wanted was that reassurance and that kind of same response that she would get from her father without actually needing it to be the physical person.
I love that. That's fantastic, isn't it? And that's actually about knowing the person and exploring with them, looking for those hidden meanings. And one of the other things when you were talking earlier on, I was thinking about is it's about the thing that they're not expressing is just to be mindful. Is it things like, is somebody in pain? Maybe what they're really trying to express is that they're in pain, that there's something going on there. Is there too much stimulation in someone's environment? I've certainly been in to some places and situations where there's a television going, there's a radio going, there's conversations, there's large family events with lots of people in there all chattering at once. And of course, you're going to see some potentially some behavioural changes there when somebody feels out of control and and that they're not able to get that sense of security in that situation. So there's a lot to think about, isn't there, when someone's behavior changes. It might not just be a straightforward thing. So one of the other questions I wanted to ask about is restlessness, because we've been asked a question already, which is what would you do if a loved one is very restless and if they want to leave home? And the person who's asked this question has actually said, some of their loved one has gone out and actually got lost in the past. So what advice would we give around that? And just a reminder, anybody in the room who wants to ask a question, listening in as we do this live, please feel free to do that and ask a question. But what advice would you give to this person who's asked the question about restlessness and someone leaving the home?
I thought always when I hear the word restlessness, it always makes me think potentially about physical needs of a person. So our main physical needs are: has the person, eating and drinking? Is the person thirsty or hungry? Has there been an adequate sleep or period of time awake? So is it that the person needs purpose and needs to do something, or is it the person needs to rest? Is there any toilet? Does the person need to use the toilet? We know that dementia can affect a person's ability to communicate their needs. So sometimes we have to be a little bit of a detective and think about, has the person, been to the toilet recently? And you'll understand yourself how it changes your behaviour if you do need the toilet and you can't get there. Is there a certain level of comfort? Is the room comfortable? Is it too warm? Is somebody wearing trousers that are 3 times too small, that are cutting their tummy, or anything like that might be causing a level of discomfort? And are there any concerns about pain? And I'd always work my way sort of down that physical need list. And then I'd also be thinking about emotional needs. Is the person bored? Do they need occupation? Are they scared? Fear is a big cause of anxiety. Are they angry? Is there something that's angered them? Or are they sad, or are they lonely? So I always think of those 5 physical needs and those 5 emotional needs. And if I get to the bottom of that and I haven't found something, then usually we find, we have, and we can support that person with that sort of information, that assessment that we have of what may be causing that restlessness.
I think in addition to what Ruby's already covered, which was excellent, Ruby, I think in addition to that, there's also the consideration of the person's kind of past lifestyle and past habits and routines, if you like. Again, drawing on my experience of working in care home settings and my own personal experience, I know for myself, my busiest time of day is kind of early evening when there's a definite shift in my day. I get home from work, I'm sorting the kids out, I'm doing the housework, it's absolute chaos for a few hours. But then in the care setting, it tends to be that the early evening is the quietest time of day. And so potentially the kind of biological clock, if you like, isn't replicated by what's going on around the person. So it may be that actually if you're finding that the person's becoming more active and is wanting to leave the home, is wanting to go for a walk, it may just be worth thinking about, well, historically, what would they have been doing around about this time? Would they have been busy, engaged in an activity? And how can we replicate that? How can we meet that need?
Yeah, it's so true. And I was thinking about that kind of life story work and really knowing the person and their likes and their patterns. Because I remember many years ago working with somebody, and it was a gentleman who every time Coronation Street used to come on, the theme tune for Coronation Street would come on, and this gentleman would start walking around the care home, trying to get his coat on, his shoes on, then going to the doors and trying to leave. And they did this for ages and ages, and it was only when we said this to his wife, she said, well, actually I used to watch Corrie on an evening once the kids had gone to bed, and he used to go down the pub while I watched Corrie. And as soon as she said that, we went, that's what he's doing. And it was almost the beep beeps of the music would start, and the cat would be on the roof, and he'd be trying to get out the door, and you knew you knew this was going to happen every time. And actually very often at 7:30 that would be the time that he would start sort of getting a bit restless and wanting to leave. I guess the other thing I'd like to touch on for people is some of the different ways to keep somebody safe if indeed they are going out. And obviously there's various types of assistive technology that's available. There's trackers, there's all sorts of things that you can get that are wearables for somebody. That means that if they do go out because they're restless, and that's what happens, is that making sure that they're safe and that you can know where they are and find them and get them back. For care providers, and indeed for families, there's something called the Herbert Protocol, which some of you might be familiar with, and this is a protocol that was introduced a number of years ago now, probably about 5 years ago, and it was really introduced and designed to ensure that people living with dementia, if they do go outside of their own garden or into the street and they get lost or go missing, that the families, the carers, have got a way of getting that person back and alerting the police. So we've got information on our website about the Herbert Protocol and the forms, but you can also obviously Google that and find out about that, because it's a really good tool. If someone does go missing, the first question the police are going to ask you is about what they might be wearing, what they might look like, where they, a recent picture, and it's just having those things all in one place so that, you're not suddenly, well, you will panic if someone goes missing, but actually, you've got some of the things there ready so that you can help to find that person and bring them back to safety as soon as possible. So anything else that anybody on the call, either Ruby or Helen, would like to add around restlessness and sort of people walking or going missing at this point?
I think just about something that always sticks with me is substitute rather than subtract. So say, for instance, the person wanted to go for a walk, is it possible that, you might be able to walk with the person? So it's not that you're restricting behaviour, it's that you're trying to facilitate it in the safest way possible. So, if the person was up and busy in the evenings, like lots of us were, are there jobs around the home that you could, help the person to get involved with to encourage activity? So I think it's just about managing, trying to be as safe as possible, but also trying to, enable a person to do the things that they want to do, because we know that often that behaviour, we call it behaviour that challenges, occurs when we're restricting somebody. You can't do that. You can't do this. You can't do that. So, always thinking about what we can do to substitute as opposed to take away.
Thanks, Ruby. Helen, anything final from you about that?
I think so. Obviously, you've mentioned the Herbert Protocol, which is an excellent system, and you've mentioned about GPS trackers. I think as well, there's additional things that people could consider, such as door sensors. So there are sensors that you can fit to doors that will then raise an alarm if they're opened after a certain time. But even something as simple as a written notice at eye level on the door, advising the person that it's best not to go out of a night time. And it's just as Ruby says, it's trying to identify ways to reduce the risk associated with the behaviour rather than stopping the person from wanting to, if they want to go for a walk. How can we make it safer?
It's so true, Helen. I love that, because if you think in your basic life, in all of our lives, in who are listening in this space, if someone says you can't do something, it doesn't actually take away always that need for you to want to do it, does it? It doesn't take away that desire to do something, and actually it can just really irritate you if someone keeps saying no, you can't do it, and you think actually I should be able to. So you kind of, it's how do you manage that, and how do you work with people around that in a way that's safe and manageable. So I want to ask a question. I think it was Ruby earlier on. You were talking about false beliefs and delusions that somebody might have. And obviously, everybody's got different personal beliefs, and we all will, in this room, we will all believe many different things, whether it's about religions, politics, all sorts of things. And obviously, we're not going to talk about that now. But what would you say are sort of the false beliefs that somebody might have, and how might you respond to that? And actually, what's the difference between a false belief and a delusion? So some questions there. I don't know who wants to jump in and try and answer those for us.
I think it's worth thinking about the term false beliefs, because quite often to the person living with dementia, they're not false. It's absolutely 100% accurate and true. And sometimes the beliefs that people have is that combination of the underlying emotion, which we've already touched upon, and then the kind of changes with their cognitive functioning. So, I often speak to families that say, "Oh, my family member believes that people are coming into the house and stealing from them," and just recently I've been speaking to a family who were saying, "Well, we're going to put video cameras in to reassure the family member that no one's coming into the house." And when we kind of thought about it in detail, it was the combination of the kind of underlying anxiety, the person kind of forgetting where she'd put the bag herself, not recognizing the difficulty she's having with her own memory. And so the logical conclusion she'd come to was, well, somebody must have come into my house and moved it. And so it's not necessarily a false belief for this lady. It was absolutely true.
Yeah, you're so right. Ruby, I think you were going to add something at the same point. Has Helen said the same as you, or have you got a different thing to add there?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Helen says, and I think just with delusions, it often can be, a fixed idea that isn't based on reality. And some of these might be that, I think a common one that I frequently hear is about financial matters, and people saying that people might be stealing my money, or they're in my bank account, or things like that. And I think a lot of things do often have financial issues, or they might feel that their partner is having relations with another person. They might be paranoid, thinking that the neighbours don't like them, or it might be, that they have memory problems, so they feel that they're in a different time and place to what we are. So it might be that they feel that they need to go to work or pick the children up from school, or relive in past traumas or events. So I think there's lots of things that come up, but frequently, the thing that commonly comes up is financial things.
And I think the other thing to add here for me is that sometimes, because someone's got dementia, sometimes people don't actually always take some of the things that they might be saying as being correct, and they might be correct. So, somebody could be stealing from them or doing something something untoward might be happening, or they might be children outside the house making a lot of noise, and then that's what the person's hearing. And so sometimes, I think we can sort of chalk things down to, oh, well, maybe it's something to do with their dementia that they're hearing this, or they're worrying about this, or they're expressing this. But actually, it could be based in truth, in something that's going on. And I've certainly worked with families where, actually with some investigation, we've discovered that unfortunately that person, there is some kind of safeguarding, there is something going on for that person, or there is certainly the children one. I worked with a lady many years ago who was getting really worried about where her own children were and was looking for her children quite a lot. And actually what we discovered was that there was a group of school children who were coming off the school bus and kind of standing outside her window having a good old chat and a good old laugh. And of course for them, they were just doing what teenage kids might do, having a chat, having a conversation. But for her, she was hearing that, and it was making her anxiety levels go up about where her children were, and what she needed to do. And I like when you said earlier on, Helen, about if somebody has got these beliefs, remembering that it's real for them, and they can be upsetting, they can be distressing. So I guess, how will you help somebody if if they are expressing something that isn't true, or you've done your investigation and you're confident that actually there isn't some kind of exploitation going on or some kind of risk to that person? And often we talk about working with somebody in a way that's kind of reassuring them, but validating what they're saying, because obviously if they're saying, well, my money's been stolen, and you say, no, it's not, end of conversation, that's not going to take away the anxiety that somebody is feeling about that. So it's about kind of, without challenging them or necessarily correcting them and saying, no, you're wrong, it's going with the emotion around that, and and being really calm and reassuring, in a way to kind of validate what that person's saying. And I think there's some of the techniques that can be really hard, especially when your loved one maybe goes to a similar theme again and again and again. And it can be difficult for families to know how to respond. And I think sometimes a strategy that might work on Monday might not work on Tuesday, and then it might work on Wednesday. So I think it's about having those strategies there to think, okay, when mum's upset about this, I'm going to validate it, and then I'm going to distract her perhaps by saying, let's have a cup of tea and a slice of cake, because that always works. Or pull your socks up, like the example you gave earlier on. And actually, what do we do? I mean, anything either of you would add around how to deal with and help somebody?
I think actually, Victoria, you've covered a lot of what we would suggest. I'm just wondering whether it's worth also just raising the difference between false beliefs and delusions and hallucinations. Because sometimes when we speak to family members and they're concerned that the person lived with dementia is suddenly experiencing hallucinations, when it's always worth thinking about, actually, is the person seeing something that physically isn't there, or is it that they're misinterpreting something that is in front of them? And there's two very different approaches to hallucinations or kind of misinterpreting what's in front of them.
Can you talk to us a little bit more about that, Helen?
Yeah, so I think, so we often talk to family members who say, oh, I don't know, my relative is seeing things crawling up the wall, or they're seeing people at the side of them. But when we then ask them to look at the environment, on occasions it's become clear that actually what they're seeing is a mirror, and it's their own reflection, or they're seeing themselves in a window, for example. And so the approach there would be, about reassuring the person, but if it was a hallucination, then potentially the underlying cause, the underlying reason for that is very, very different. And with hallucinations, there can be other issues to address. So I think primarily the first step is to just stop and think, is this something that the person's seeing or hearing that isn't there in reality? Or is it that the person's misinterpreting what is there?
Fantastic, Helen. Ruby, anything you'd like to add to what Helen's just said? I think that was really good.
Yeah, really good, really good. I think just sometimes to de-escalate behaviours, I feel a really powerful word is sorry. And I think sometimes we've all had an experience in our past recently, probably, in which you've had bad customer service or someone's done something to upset you. And you know how you feel yourself when that person doesn't acknowledge it or say sorry. Um, so even though it might be a different reality, and it might not be something that you've done specifically to the person, for that person, it might be really powerful for you to say, I'm sorry you're experiencing this. I'm sorry you feel that I've done this, and taking some of the ownership, because I think often to de-escalate behaviour, we have to really let the person know that we are there, we're taking them seriously, we're listening to what they're saying, and we're also sorry. And I think sometimes that can just help de-escalate behaviour and help you to move into things like distraction, because sometimes moving into distraction can be hard if we've not connected with the person enough for them to feel that we're going to support them.
Thank you so much, Ruby. And I think you just reminded us of something so important in the power of saying sorry, excuse me, and actually the power for you as an individual when you say sorry to somebody. It reduces your own anxiety, it reduces your own stress, and even if you might think, actually, I've not done anything wrong in this situation, but actually if you say sorry, it does completely de-escalate it for you and also for that other person, doesn't it? So it's a really important thing to remember. And you can always say, I'm sorry you're experiencing this. I'm sorry you feel this way. I'm sorry, this is what you think this has happened, or that must have been really distressing, and I'm sorry that you're feeling that way. So fantastic advice. Really, really, really pleased with all of that advice, and thank you for sharing. I'm just going to do a quick reminder for people who are in the room, and then I want to have a conversation about sundowning, because we've been asked this question specifically about that, and obviously the clocks are due to change as well. So but before I do that, I just want to remind everybody listening, if you do want to ask us any question while we're here today, while we're here, please do that. Please request the mic, come along, ask us a question. We're more than happy to try and answer those for you. What we can't do as part of this space is offer any clinical advice. So if specifically to your situation. So if you wanted to come on and say, my mum's doing X, we wouldn't be able to say do this, because that's not really what we want to do. But if you want to come on and say, how might you respond to somebody when they were doing, if they were saying, or what behaviour they were displaying, we can offer advice around that. And obviously, if you do want any specific tailored clinical advice, you can contact some of the teams that we've got available to support you, and offer that. And I will share into the nest, which will show up in the space very soon, a quick reminder to how to contact some of our teams to get any clinical support that you might need. So after doing that quick reset, obviously, so feel free to join us on stage if you'd like to. But can I ask you, I'm going to go to you first, Helen. Sundowning is a term that we're quite familiar with. I guess we are, and probably lots of people living with dementia are as well. But can you tell us a little bit more about what it actually means?
Yeah, of course. So the term sundowning refers to a change in the person's behaviour and a change in the person's presentation. I think with sundowning, kind of the assumption is that it happens in the evening or at night time, but actually these changes can occur at any time of day. And you often see increased confusion, increased anxiety, potentially more challenging behaviours, increased frustration, and quite often an increase in physical activity. So it can be very, very difficult for family members to try and support somebody through this period of change, especially when it's happening on a daily basis and can often last for hours at a time. Is that okay, Victoria?
Oh, sorry. Yes, that's absolutely fine. Sorry, I was muted and didn't unmute myself. So why does sundowning happen? Why do people get it? What's it about?
Um, there's lots of different theories, and I think the reality is nobody knows for definite why sundowning happens. So there's the theory that it could be our kind of biological clock. There's evidence that melatonin may play a part in this. It could be that as the sun's starting to set, people the kind of the amount of light and increased shadows and things like that. So how things look changes. It could be increased tiredness. There's no one clear answer. It is very much about thinking around the individual and what's impacting them.
Ruby, anything you'd like to add? Thanks, Helen. That was a really good, comprehensive talk through that. Anything you'd like to add, Ruby?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Helen, and I think often it could be that behaviours become repetitive. So I think it's looking at patterns really, I think is important and helpful. What could it be that's happened during the day or during the night, depending on when the behaviours occurring that might be causing that behaviour. And by looking at patterns, we might then be able to think about how we might prevent it from happening. We're looking for triggers. Is it when it starts to get dark, the person is asking to go home? So can we reduce the sensory changes that a person experiences when it gets dark? So it might be that you close the curtains and switch the lights on just before it gets dark to try and prevent the behaviours. So I think it all depends on what the person is, what they're doing and what they're saying, how they, what are they wanting, what do you feel they need at that time, and thinking about how you might meet that need, or is there a potential that you can prevent it from happening by engaging the person in something that they enjoy before you feel that the behaviour might happen.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head for me there, because I think it's often about that having that daytime routine and having that structure, and where possible trying to, especially now you can, it's, we're not in lockdown, it's nice and sunny over where most of us are. Get outside, get some sunlight, get some vitamin D, get that, and that makes a difference. Gentle walk during the day will make you, less likely to have a nap in the middle of the day, more likely to have a good night's sleep. So trying to kind of think about those things. And then that, for me, it's also about that nighttime routine. So, we all do it anyway, don't we, to a certain degree. I talked earlier about the gentleman who watched Coronation Street, or well, actually he didn't. He went to the pub and his wife watched Coronation Street. And actually, it's about having that regular evening routine that works, that settles you down, that settles your person down. For me personally, once my kids are in bed, I sit down and I have a warm drink on the sofa, and it's really rock and roll, isn't it? But that's what works for me as part of my evening routine. And Helen, you spoke about that kind of busy period where the kids come home and there's lots of noise, and but those routines are actually really important, and any changes to them, you can feel a bit out of sorts, and like your day hasn't closed properly and things haven't ended. So where possible, trying to kind of have some of those routines in place to have a successful night. And I like what you're talking about, closing the curtains. And Helen, you mentioned earlier about mirrors. because often people can misinterpret reflections, and mirrors cast lights and shadows all over rooms. And certainly some houses you can go into and you might have nice patio windows that look like a mirror that reflect back in, lots of pictures on the wall, with places and people, and again, glass on the front and reflective surfaces. So it's sometimes about just looking at the environment and thinking, what might the person be getting stimulation from in here, and what might be going on. So to sort of looking at all of those. Is there any other tips that you might be able to offer for preventing sundowning at this point?
I think sometimes the kind of symptoms, if you like, of sundowning can be exacerbated if the person's tired. So it may be about kind of regulating activity during the day, but also not supporting the person sleeping during the day, because there's always a danger of if you've slept or catnapped throughout the day, then the person's simply not tired in the evening. And often that can be difficult because the family member or the carer is tired, but the person living with dementia has had an hour or so sleep during the day. So again, like you've said, Victoria, it's about that nighttime routine and trying to establish that.
It's so important. Ruby, anything else you'd like to ask? And then I've got a question that's just been sent to me by a DM that I'll read out. But anything else on sundowning, Ruby, that you'd like to add?
I think just recognition that it can be very difficult. And are there other people? Have you got friends or family that can support and offer you any help? Because sometimes it may be that the behaviours are repetitive and that becomes more and more stressful, and that may lead to yourself as a carer becoming more stressed. So thinking about people or services who might be able to offer you some support as well, because sometimes we just can't solve everything quickly and overnight, and lots of things are trial and error. So I think it's really important that you have support behind you with it too.
I
It's
think
true.
as well, sorry, just to add to that, Ruby, I think as well, it's about having different approaches that you can use, because as you touched on earlier, Victoria, what works one night may not necessarily work the next night. So it's about having a selection of approaches that you can take.
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? And that's what I was going to say. It's about having your tool bag ready and knowing what's worked, and knowing your person, and actually knowing the things that might help them. My husband knows when I need feeding, for example, and he'll say, "Oh, it's time to give you some food," because he knows my levels are going up. So it's about knowing your person and knowing how to work with them. So Mary, I've just seen your hand go up, so I will come to you in a second. I've had a question sent in via DM, which I'm just going to ask Helen and Ruby as well. So the question is, what would you do if you think your mum's putting something on? So this is somebody who's saying that they're worried that their mum's putting things on at times, and it gets them frustrated, and that they don't know how to respond to that and what to do. So what advice would you give this person?
I think often, because we can't see at the level of damage that happens to a person's brain, and what we see is how the person is communicating with us, how they are verbally and non-verbally. I think often it can come across as very personal, or as though the person knows what they're doing and maybe doing it to get a reaction. But I think, given the nature of brain changes and frontal lobe changes, I think often that it's what I would call rational detachment, and that's about seeing the level of the damage as opposed to the person. And I always think that helps in understanding that it's it might be the case, but often it's not. It's the lack of control or changes in control of behaviour or being more impulsive often can make a person look as though they know what they're doing. So in those two instances, I think often it's about understanding that dementia is likely to be causing these behaviour changes. Or secondly, are they doing it for reaction? And is it potentially the reaction that they're seeking at that time? So that's what I would say. I think it's often it feels very much as though the person is doing it either intentionally, but I think it's more likely that it's due to the brain changes that we can see these changes in behaviour, and it's important to understand that.
I think in addition to that, so it's also worth thinking about that, quite often we speak to family members who say, oh, the person with dementia can be perfectly polite amongst strangers and amongst other people, but then seem much, much worse with me. And, it's worth thinking about that when trying to put on a kind of social front, if you like, that's very, very difficult and very, very tiring. And there's actually potentially a bit of a backhanded compliment there that the person living with dementia feels so safe in the connection that they have with you that they can let that guard down and not have to put on that kind of front, if you like. And so, as the person that they trust, they're able to be themselves, which can potentially, I can understand the feeling, oh, my family members putting this on, that they're making it much worse for me than for other people. But as I say, actually, that could be because the person feels so strongly the connection with you that they don't have to put on those airs and graces.
Thank you so much, Helen. And you just reminded me about the social front that we all have, and it's that all of us behave a certain way in public, and we try to hope that we might behave that same way at home when with our loved ones, but it's not always the case, is it? And I think it is quite powerful, that the ability to maintain a social front when you're out, and then it to perhaps be quite different when you're at home is really important to acknowledge that. And it is about that person feeling safe and secure, isn't it, when they're at home and with you. So thank you both for answering that question. I hope that's answered the question for you. Mary, I've added you as a speaker because I think you have a question for us. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I'd like to say how brilliant you all are. I don't think myself and my sisters wouldn't have got through the last 12 months without you guys. So thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts. It was 13 months ago, my father died, and him and my mother had been married for 60 years. Now, mother since then has deteriorated really rapidly and gone into a care home, which is fine, and we're content with that. But prior to going in the care home and after father dying, she became quite obsessed with the fact that men were after her I don't know how to put this politely, really, but sexually after her. Not agitated, but she felt, oh, look at me, the men are after me. And since she's moved into the care home, she does come out with some quite oh, rather nice, I fancy him, and it could be one of the young carers, the chaps, or somebody from her past, or I need to be in touch with so and so. It's quite difficult to deal with that with dad now being dead, and also I'm not really very sure how to respond to her when she is like that.
It's difficult, but thank you first off for your lovely feedback at the start, and thank you for joining us in the space and sharing your story, and actually it's I can hear the emotion in your voice while you're talking about that, because it is difficult, isn't it? It is often difficult to deal with these things. I'm going to go straight to Ruby and Helen, and ask them what advice they might offer you around the situation that you're in, how to deal with it, and obviously remind you that about our helpline, and phoning that way as well and getting some support. Helen, I can see you're unmuted.
Yeah, I think so again, when we speak to family members either on the helpline or the closer to home service, we often hear people saying, oh, that their personality's changed and they're now doing things that they would never ever have done. I think it's worth thinking about it, my belief is that actually the personality hasn't changed. Potentially what you're seeing is more of the person's raw personality coming through. And potentially with the diagnosis of dementia, that kind of social filter that we've talked about is reduced. And the person's awareness of the impact their behaviour and what they're saying is having on others is also reduced. When you then combine that with, often people living with dementia believe they are much younger in years and can almost kind of go back in history, if you like. Potentially, Mary, I can appreciate how upsetting this behaviour and what mum is saying for you. I can appreciate how upsetting and distressing that is, but potentially for mum, it's perfectly natural. So if mum believes that she's a couple of decades younger and is an attractive young female and is paying compliments about the men around her, you can kind of understand where that might be coming from.
I can get into her head, scarily. I can get into her head. Yes, I understand that. It's just, and I think some of the emotion comes from the fact that Dad's hardly cold in his grave. I don't wish to be rude about it.
No, and that's really
Dad's
hard.
hardly cold in his grave, and she was a very good-looking woman, and she, I understand that, but it's how to respond to her when she says to me, "Oh, Jamie, the carer, oh, I could quite fancy him." You can't say to somebody with dementia, because they believe that, like, I understand what you're saying about them feeling decade. What do I say to her? In the past, I felt mean because I've said that's rather inappropriate. But it isn't to them, is it? So how do I respond?
I think that's it, Mary. I think it depends on if mum's distressed by it, if she's worried about it, or then you would obviously respond differently. But I think if you can, you've got to remember she isn't saying that to be disrespectful to Dad in any way at all, or and actually you can sometimes, my grandma used to do the same thing. We used to have good fun, and we'd say, well, yeah, they are, or they are quite dishy, aren't they? And and actually it was just gave her a good giggle and a bit of fun, and and it can be difficult, but it can also just make a bit of humor in a situation, because if you say to someone, correcting them and saying, well, actually, no, that's not appropriate, it makes them wonder why not. Why is he not good looking? Is there something I'm missing? So I think sometimes it's remembering that mum's not saying these things to be in any way, shape, or form disrespectful. Sorry, Helen.
No, that's okay. I think, Mary, I don't think there'd be any harm in basically delicately saying to your mum that that's not a conversation you're comfortable having. You're not saying that's not appropriate for mum to be saying, but what you could say to mum is, that's not a conversation I would like to have with you.
Okay. Yeah.
That's not a bad idea. Because it's a conversation you might not want to have with your mum, is it? It might not be. Yeah.
I mean, we come from a very artistic family, and mother's is very intelligent woman, but it's not really a conversation I want to have about, But this is quite difficult to hear coming from your mother when she's 86 years old.
So I don't think there'd be any harm in saying exactly that to Mum, Mary. You're not criticising what she's saying. Okay. You're just making her aware that it's not a topic of conversation you're particularly comfortable with, and maybe she should be having that conversation with somebody else.
You just feel like you're treading on eggshells all the time. Is that going to set her off on because parents with dementia, in my experience so far, they can swing quite quickly to, well, why don't you think that? Or, well, I don't think it, it's you feel like you're constantly treading on eggshells. And I just didn't know what to say to her, to say, well, this is inappropriate, mother. I don't need to be having this conversation with you. And perhaps I should have just said that.
Oh, and I guess the thing is, you just until you try something, you don't always know how someone's going to respond, and how they're going to take something. So sometimes it is about just having a go and seeing, and seeing what response you get, and of course, if it causes mum distress and that she gets upset about that, you might think, well, okay, that's not. I'm going to go with that technique again. I'm going to try a different technique
Yeah.
and see. We've amazingly, but thank you so much, Mary, for joining us and asking the question. We've amazingly come to the end of our space this evening. Thank you for joining us, Mary, for asking your question. I know there was another question about diet and exercise and the difference that has when someone is experiencing sundowning, and in general, just to answer that super quickly, I would say good diet, healthy diet, exercise regularly, getting out is so important. So please do use that. All that's left really is to thank everybody for another amazing session. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for joining us with the questions that you've asked. Thanks so much, Ruby and Helen, for joining me tonight and in this space. I'm going to end the room now, and we will be joining you again in a month's time. So thank you, everybody. And of course, if you missed the session and want to share it, we do share it on social media afterwards. Thank you. Goodbye.